The Shea tree in Zalugu had stood longer than names could travel, its bark thick as old stories and its canopy wide enough to hold a market's worth of shade. For Abena it was an altar of ordinary things, of calabashes rinsed clean, of homework done by the last light, of whispers tucked where goats could not overhear. For Kwame it was a drafting table, the roots his rulers, the dirt his paper, the sky his geometry. They were 17 and stubborn and certain that the world, if petitioned politely, would make room for their plans. On this evening the air smelled of smoke and groundnut stew. Drums thudded somewhere beyond the fields, practicing for a wedding, and cicadas stitched the background with tiny needles of sound. Abena sat on a low root and teased apart a fraying basket reed. "If you invent a roof that doesn't leak," she said, "I'll invest our first profits in hats." Kwame grinned and drew a round hut in the dust, then squared it, then added a veranda as if wealth could be penciled in. "I'll study engineering," he said, tapping the earth. "I'll make walls that cool themselves and water that listens when you call." She rolled her eyes, smiling anyway. "And I'll build a Shea cooperative," she answered, "with labels so fine even tamale boutiques will behave." Their banter swung like a hammock. Neither said the word love, both were fluent in its grammar. When a breeze ruffled the leaves, Kwame pulled a small knife and carved their initials low on the trunk, AK, where only patient eyes would notice. He pressed a Shea nut into her palm. "For luck," he murmured. Abena closed her fingers around its smooth promise and felt the thud of her pulse meet the nut's coolness. They planned the week the way shopkeepers count change. Market on Tuesday, chores on Thursday, meet after sunset whenever the moon lifted early. Promises felt easy under that ancient crown. Later they walked the footpath home, mud brick walls glimmering with heat. The tree watched them go without blinking, a witness made of shade and sap. The letter rode into the village in the postman's canvas bag, folded like a bird at rest. Kwame tried to be dignified while the man dismounted, but his fingers betrayed him, drumming against his thigh. When he tore the envelope, the world rearranged itself into a corridor leading south. Scholarship. University accommodation. A stipend that looked, to eyes used to counting sadies like seeds, like ocean water, vast, glittering, impossible. By evening the courtyard had become a ceremony. Aunties argued over which shirts should travel. Uncles counseled him to remember his prayers. Boys slapped his shoulders trying to catch a flake of luck. Someone tuned a radio to high life and the zinc roofs hummed. Abena stood at the periphery with a calabash balanced on her hip and a smile that held its posture under weight. She was happy, of course she was, but happiness can sit beside fear and share a bowl. When the moon stepped over the threshold of the sky, they met at the Shea tree. "You'll write," she said, aiming for lightness and landing near plea. "I'll write like rain," he answered. She handed him a cloth pouch of roasted nuts and a strip of indigo ribbon. "For when the city forgets to be kind," she said. They plotted small coordinates. Call on Sundays from the kiosk, save receipts, send photos, study hard. He promised to come home for Damba. She promised to sell enough butter to buy a proper stamp book. They sat until the night cooled their talk into quiet. On the walk back, Abena counted the steps between her and the future and understood that distance is measured in more than kilometers. The tree kept their silhouettes like charcoal sketches against its trunk and stored their plans in the patient ledger of its rings. Accra took up the whole horizon the first day, then refused to fit inside Kwame's head. Trotros argued with taxis, preachers with traffic, gulls with the Atlantic wind. The lorry park smelled of diesel, ripened mango, and ambition warmed over. At the university, buildings lifted like questions. The library was a village of quiet. He placed the Shea nut on his windowsill, a brown moon above the radiator, and whispered his timetable as if it were a prayer. In the robotics club he met Efua, who wore a camera like a second heartbeat and laughter like a streetlight. She knew where the Wi-Fi behaved and which canteen auntie was generous with stew. "You're from the north?" she asked, not unkindly, when he mispronounced a cafe name. "Then you know how to chase a horizon." She took a photo of his hands soldering a joint, light catching the small tremor of concentration. He emailed Abena the picture with a paragraph about circuits that sounded, even to himself, like boasting. Nights bled into mornings. Lectures, labs, laundry done at odd hours in a corridor that smelled of soap and futures. On Sundays he queued at the kiosk to call home, watching his pulse beat in the cable that disappeared into the wall. Bad connections turned Abena's voice into a river over stones. He told her about the ocean, about vending machines, about the way the city's lights pretended to be stars. She told him about price swings, a goat that birthed twins, a neighbor who fell ill and got better, slowly, properly. In Zalugu the sun kept its schedule and so did Abena. Before light, pestle and mortar. After dawn, sorting shea nuts by sound, the dull resignation of bad ones, the bright click of good. Her mother taught her to read the fire with her nose and to feel the oil with her wrists, when it slicked like river stones, when it needed patience, when it deserved to rest. Work sang a low, practical song she could dance to with her feet on the ground. Market days unrolled like woven mats. Abena arranged calabashes in precise crescents, tied ribbons of dyed cloth around the necks, experimented with a paper label she copied from a cosmetic jar in Tamale. Ingredients, origin, a hopeful phone number. Buyers asked their customary catechism. Does it soften scars? Does it soothe a crying baby? Will the jar spill in heat? She answered with the confidence of someone who has burned her fingers enough times to earn it and smiled until bargaining softened into trust. Letters from the capital arrived like rain in Harmattan. Late, miraculous, insufficient. She read them under the shea tree while goats traced parentheses in the dust. When Kofi, the bicycle parts trader with borrowed cologne and tidy compliments, lingered by her stall, she kept her kindness folded. My hands are full, she told him, lifting a calabash that shone back her reflection. At night, she tucked Kwame's pages into a wooden box and put the box under her pillow as if dreams could learn a forwarding address. Temptation in the city wore a necktie and a name badge. After the robotics club demonstrated a drone on a rooftop ringed with student applause, strangers shook Kwame's hand as if confirming a rumor about his future. Someone said internship like a blessing. Someone said relocation like a spell. Efua photographed the sunset behind him, the sky spilling its pockets of color, and captioned it, Northern Boy Chasing Light. The likes arrived like moths to a bulb. That night he missed Abena's call. The hostile generator coughed into silence, and he fell asleep in a pool of study notes. In the morning he composed an apology that sounded better than it felt and promised a longer call on Sunday. Days sprinted. Buses broke down. A professor extended a deadline and then reconsidered. Rain arrived sideways and left in a mood. He carried his guilt like small change, always there, clinking, never quite enough to buy absolution. Walking back from the lab, he palmed the shea nut and tried to remember the exact texture of the root where they sat. The city's light threw copies of himself onto pavements, too many to gather back. At a cafe, Efua asked about his village. He told her stories about moonlit football, slow weddings, the way shade could be a currency. You'll take me one day, she said, half challenge, half charm. He smiled and changed the subject, because saying no felt like tugging a thread he wasn't ready to follow to its end. Harmattan came, whitening the edges of the world, and with it came a photograph that slipped through cousins and colleagues until it landed like a small stone in Abena's lap. Kwame on a rooftop, smiling beside Efua, city lights gathering like curious spirits behind them. The caption read, Team after a great demo. It offered nothing and everything. Her stomach went tight as a drumhead. She folded the phone face down and finished serving a customer with hands that remembered their work. That evening Kofi hovered again with his jokes that sounded pre-worn. A woman like you should not lift heavy things, he said, reaching for a calabash he had not earned. Abena took it back with a smile that showed exactly no teeth. A man like you should not say light things, she answered, and that ended the conversation. Under the shea tree she wrote a letter that did not accuse. It inquired, which is the sharper blade. Kwame's reply arrived with commas of apology and crowded assurances. He explained the event, praised her patience, promised a visit at Damba. She read it 3 times and then read the space between the lines, which is where truth usually rests. The tree listened in its wooden way. Somewhere, goats negotiated in their civil voices. In the blue hour, she leaned her back against the trunk and decided that trust is not a feeling but a craft, and she would practice it. The drought announced itself without ceremony. Wells sighed lower. Sorghum leaves folded their thin hands. In the women's yard the roasting fires had to be coaxed, and still the nuts took longer to surrender their oil. Abena stared at the piles of raw fruit and saw calendars, margins, risk. She had heard of a cooperative that dried nuts on raised racks so dust kept its distance and mold mined its manners. She sketched a memory of the racks in charcoal on a rice sack, measuring with her thumb joints. The men laughed kindly until the structure stood taller than her pride, a simple frame strung with netting, and the first batch dried clean as a good idea. The aunties came around with praise disguised as advice. Abena wrote everything down in a notebook rescued from her cousin's school things and learned new words from a borrowed pamphlet. Grant, pilot, scale, each one a little drumbeat in her chest. She taught Coco, the widow from across the field, to sort by sound, and Coco taught her a song for steady work. At night, she sat by a lamp that smoked and drafted a label that looked less like hope and more like product. Zulugu Shade, she wrote, then underlined origin, ingredients, contact, price. She felt very far from Kwame and, simultaneously, exactly where his respect would find her. The tree shook off a strip of dust, like blessing. He returned for Damba with a shirt that satisfied his aunties and a careful expression that satisfied no one. Drums climbed the night, and the moon wore a white cloth. The chief danced measured circles. Boys leaped the fires. Girls clapped patterns you could solve if you'd lived there long enough. Kwame found Abena at the edge where the crowd thinned into dark, her scarf catching stray starlight. Their hello tripped once, then found its feet. Under the Shea tree they laid out the months like market goods. He told her about the lab, the competition, the way the city could make you feel like a miracle in the morning and a mistake by evening. She told him about racks and receipts, about Coco's song, about the way drought sharpened everyone's voice. I saw the photo, she said finally. He held her gaze and explained without embroidery. The word friend can be a bridge or a blindfold. They chose bridge and walked it slowly. Before dawn they planted 3 Shea seedlings in a patient triangle around the old trunk. For what we will still grow, Abena said, pressing the soil the way you settle a blanket on a sleeping child. On parting they did not lean too hard on the word forever. They picked a date, a bus time, a list of tasks. Love, they were learning, keeps better when measured, labeled, and sealed against heat. Exams tightened the city like a belt. Campus grew quiet at odd hours, then erupted when a generator recovered its temper. Efua offered to rehearse with Kwame for a presentation, her edits sharp and kind. They worked in a cafe where the ceiling fans clicked like large insects with errands. When she squeezed his hand after a clean run-through, he felt the warmth and stepped back from it as from a threshold he did not intend to cross. That night he opened a new document and titled it, Solar Dehydrator, Village Pilot. He drew what he could build with scrap and modest panels, how air would move, how cost would behave. He wrote to Abena, not apologies this time but diagrams and questions. Could they test near the racks? Could Coco help measure moisture? Her reply braided praise with practicality. Yes, yes. And replaced the second hinge with rope. Hinges rust. He began to say no to invitations that would turn into yes he would regret. The city, surprisingly, did not punish him. It only turned down its volume when he walked by. On Sundays he queued for calls with a calm he had earned. He described the project. She described a buyer in Tamale who wanted steady supply. Between them, a thread thickened until it felt like twine you could pull real things with, not merely hopes. On a Saturday market in Tamale, Abena set up a table with neat jars and a hand-painted sign that decided to be confident. The label read Zulugu Shade in letters that wavered only a little. She had receipts in a tin and a pen that worked on the first try, which felt like an omen. By noon a trickle of customers had turned to a respectable stream. A woman with a baby asked questions in a tone honed by disappointments. Abena answered each as if measuring flour, level, precise, generous where it counted. An NGO worker paused, bought 2 jars and left a card. If you can keep quality consistent, there might be a small grant for equipment, she said as if talking about weather. The words entered Abena and rearranged furniture. She walked home lighter, an empty box under her arm and a future that did not feel like myth. At dusk she noted everything in the ledger, each line a small step toward solvency. Back under the Shea tree she allowed herself 10 full minutes of pride. Then she listed what must follow. Train 2 more women, source better lids, standardize roasting times. She imagined Kwame's dehydrator humming beside the racks. Sunlight turned into discipline. The old tree kept still, the seedlings nearby flickering in a wind that smelled faintly of rain and road. The rumor arrived first, as rumors prefer. A company was mapping land for a plantation, offering jobs with the tidy generosity of brochures. Later the surveyors came with tape measures, fluorescent vests, and a smile that said we are reasonable men. On their map the oldest Shea tree was a dot that did not argue. Abena stood with arms folded and a question that did. Where will the shade go? Meetings in the chief's yard grew hot. Some villagers liked the arithmetic of salaries, others trusted the algebra of trees, the way shade multiplied possibilities. Abena wrote to Kwame not for a rescue but for clarity. He replied with numbers and names. A legal clinic at the university, documentation to gather, testimonies to collect. Photograph everything that shade makes possible, he added. She borrowed a cousin's phone and set about it like homework. She captured children studying in afternoon cool, elders playing drafts on the roots flat table, women rolling butter while stories kept time. She interviewed Coco, who spoke of trees as if they were aunties with specific moods. When she looked at the images later, she felt something larger than indignation. It was love for a place enacted in 1,000 small measurable acts. The seedlings trembled as if seconding the motion. Kwame arrived with 2 students from the clinic carrying folders, and with Efua, whose newsroom wanted a story that didn't bruise into cliché. The first meeting unfolded in a borrowed classroom where chalk dust rose like objections. The company representative explained timelines and community development as if reading a recipe. The clinic students asked for environmental assessments and customary land records. Abena watched the man smile fight a yawn and win. Efua walked the village with her camera as if listening. She filmed the tree at different hours, its shade migrating, its usefulness traveling. She interviewed aunties, youth, the imam, the herbalist who collected leaves with a reverence that improved his posture. Abena and Efua circled each other like wary cats and then, slowly, like colleagues. Jealousy is hard to feed when respect sits down at the table. At night Abena and Kwame spread papers under the Shea tree and matched clauses to customs, stamps to stories. He was good with edges and definitions, she was better with consequences. Laughter slid in where fear had tightened the day. When they packed the files, the seedlings flicked dew like applause. The case was not won, but it was finally dressed for the journey. The hearing was brief, bristling, and not at all cinematic. The judge wore the patience of someone who has seen promises carve grooves in air. The company's documents arrived with glossy starch. The communities arrived with photographs, affidavits, maps that looked hand-drawn because they were. The clinic students argued precedent. Abena spoke once, plainly, and the room leaned closer. In the end the court ordered a pause and a proper assessment. It was not victory. It was a door left unlocked. Efua's story went out on regional radio and traveled further than petrol usually allows. Shade is economy, she said into the microphone, and somewhere drivers nodded at traffic lights and aunties paused at sinks. Donations trickled in like shy relatives, small, heartfelt, unignorable in aggregate. Abena bought better lids and a ledger that didn't curl at the edges. She trained Amina and Vida, who would train 2 more. An email arrived for Kwame like a swallowed gasp. A graduate program abroad, tuition covered, work in a lab that could make his diagrams hum. He read it twice and felt the horizon rearrange itself. He walked to the ocean and tried to speak sense to water. Then he called Abena because what you carry alone grows heavier by the step. They did not stage a drama for the choice, they conducted an audit. Pros and cons went into the ledger like inventory. Kwame rolled the Shea nut in his palm and asked what leaving would mean in 5 years, not 5 gestures. Abena listened and answered as if laying bricks, one after the other, level. If you go, she said, go like a farmer, leave seed, leave tools, leave instructions, then return in season. In the end he accepted with a deferral of 1 year to pilot the solar dehydrator in 3 villages, to write manuals that made sense in shade and in sun, to train teams who would not wait for him to log on before solving a jam. He drew budgets that could stand up without wobbling. She coordinated schedules with the ferocity of a conductor. Work, when shared, becomes music. On the last night before he returned to Accra, they sat under the Shea tree without packing language around the silence. The seedlings had fattened their leaves. A wind combed the branches and found no complaint. I will go, he said. I will come back, he added. Abena nodded. We will hold the ground, she said. It sounded like a vow because it was. A year can be a season or a lifetime depending on whether you are counting days or outcomes. By Harmattan's return the workyard hummed. Solar dehydrators clicked softly like diligent insects. Jars cooled and rose, labels straight as good posture. A chalkboard announced prices, savings targets, training dates. Amina had trained Miriam, who had trained Vita's cousin, and the ledger fattened honestly. The seedlings near the old tree had conceded to the idea of becoming trees. Kwame stood beneath a simple canopy he'd helped design, watching the women calibrate timers and note moisture levels. He had a flight date in his pocket and a return date penciled larger than any airport. He handed Abena a binder. Schematics, supplier lists, troubleshooting pages dotted with grease. She handed him a small book. Orders secured, names, birthdays, harvest notes. They looked at each other as people do who have built something that will survive an argument. They did not ask the Shea tree for blessing. It had already given shade, which is a sacrament. When the wind moved through the leaves, it sounded like pages turning in a book they were finally writing together. Children zigzagged between roots, turning the space into a game with rules only they could remember. Love, no longer a rope bridge, was a road, graded, signposted, and busy with the work of going and coming home.